Hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the MIT Faculty Forum. My name is Emily Tao, and I will be your moderator today. I'm an MIT alum, and currently I'm an ITRI-Rosenfeld Postdoctoral Fellow at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I'm doing research on energy efficiency in water desalination and water reuse. So as a reminder, we welcome your questions during this chat. For any MIT alumni joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A feature found in your toolbar. And for all others listening via YouTube, you can add your questions to the comments field and I will get to them. We also encourage you to tweet using MIT Better World, hashtag MIT Better World, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So today we're going to hear from a panel of experts who will share some of their current projects and research on clean water in the developing and developed world. So first up, we have Pierre Nshimyimana, who's the Alfred P. Sloan MoBE Postdoctoral Fellow at Michigan State University. We'll also hear from Karen Noiva, who's a research assistant at MIT, and Daniele Lantagne, who's an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts University. Finally, we'll hear from Kenneth Strzepek, who's professor emeritus at University of Colorado, research scientist at MIT, and an adjunct professor at Harvard Kennedy School. Pierre, I would love you to go first. You might catch us up on your career since leaving MIT, and then talk about your current projects. Go ahead, Pierre.
Hi, thank you, Emery. My name is Pierre Nshimyimana. I have a doctorate in civil environmental engineering. I have been working on water since I was young, I would say. So currently, I am based here at Michigan State University. I'm Alfred P. Sloan Microbiology of Built Environment Fellow. And my current project and research is focusing on understanding the role of viromes, trying to understand viruses and microbiomes within an aquarium, considering an aquarium as a built environment where we take marine animals and freshwater animals, we bring them in an aquarium. So we want to understand, can we improve the engineering of the system if we understand better what the viromes and microbiome within the systems are doing. So before starting my current work, I was working with Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And I was involved with the Urban Genomics project, where I was working with advanced molecular biology tools to enhance the detection of fecal pollutions in surface water. So currently in Singapore, they have different reservoirs that they would like to turn to recreational activities and recreational use. So the question is, are we able to detect human fecal contamination so that we can better advise the public to improve the overreaching goal of improving public health of users. So my work focused much more on human fecal indicators. So currently the markers I validated are being used in Singapore, but they can also be extended to Southeast Asia. And also, while I was in Singapore, I had a chance to work on water technologies, worked with Water RAM, where one of the technology worked on Filtrate Plus. If you are familiar with a bike pump, the technology looks like a bike pump, but the pumping increases the pressure and allows the water to filter through a ceramic filtration. It's designed for developing countries, currently being used in Southeast Asia. So during Singapore Water Week 2006, our idea or our initiative was selected to be the best company to invest in. So we think that would be with the work I did with WaterArm as entrepreneur leader and the device now that we have in different countries in Southeast Asia, it's helping. It have been applied already in Malaysia during flooding. So all of those different projects helps me to understand better, water quality and try to see how we can improve water accessibility for general ecosystems, but also for developing countries in terms of water accessibility at home and household level. I think that's it for me now. That should be enough. If someone may have a question, we can have a discussion later. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre. Karen, I'd like to hear from you next.
Hi, my name is Karen Noiva. I did my bachelor's at MIT in 2008, and my work is focused on, and then I continued on into the graduate program in building technology. And recently I completed my PhD. So I'll talk a little bit about what my research is. It's focused on sustainable urban water management. So cities are an increasingly important scale for looking at global water resources and water availability. There's 4 billion people living in urban areas with an additional 2.3 billion expected by 2050. Already 0.2 billion people have experienced perennial water scarcity, and this is just in terms of physical resources. It doesn't consider economics or access. Unfortunately, the conventional approach to water resources is for cities to look beyond their city boundary and expand their watersheds in order to meet increasing demand. But this is increasingly difficult because 41% of terrestrial land area has already been tapped for urban water resources alone, and that's not even considering agricultural water use. So one of the increasing bywords for urban water management is sustainability. And but sustainability has multiple dimensions, not just total water use, but it's also looking to use the water you are using in a more efficient and effective way. And it therefore has dimensions in terms of physical and like land use and other types of perspectives. And so, and what is one of the questions that we have is, what does sustainable water management look like for different cities around the world? We wouldn't expect the same approach to be used in Boston as in Cairo or Singapore. There's going to be differences between each water system. But would we expect a different approach for every city, or will there be some approaches that multiple cities might use and learn from each other? So my research recently has been focusing on getting a sense of what this international perspective is. So looking, a recent study, we looked at 142 cities from around the world, variety of different sizes, different climates, and different development levels. And using statistical clustering, we identified 6 distinct types of cities. And why this is interesting is because we did this using only a few simple metrics. And in doing this, we also gained like perspective into a complex area for management. And as I think Ken will talk about later, that this is important because we don't expect a one-size-fits-all solution for all the cases. And so we need a way to sort of scale down from the global scale to individual management issues. I think that's a good summary for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Next, we'd like to hear from Danielle. Danielle, please.
Hi. I wanted to say thank you everybody for having me here today and for joining in. And my career, I did my bachelor's and master's in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT. Between that, I did some watershed management work, and then I spent 8 years working for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. My PhD is actually in infectious tropical diseases. So now I consider myself more of a public health engineer. And so from the water side, I'm coming much more from the disease prevention side. And when I think about disease prevention side of water, I think about ideally everyone would have safe drinking water piped into their home. They wouldn't have to do their own treatment. This would be provided and available on a 24/7 access. In most of the US, this is what's available, centrally treated water piped into your home. In a variety of contexts, emergencies, emerging economies, conflict affected areas, this isn't always possible. And then we think about centralization as much as we possibly can. So point of collection systems where you go to a well and it's treated as the water comes out of the well. Central kiosks where you can go purchase your water and bring it back that are managed by the local economic sector, trucked water. And in the lowest case situations for rural areas, those affected by outbreaks, those with kind of no centralized water available, we look at household level water treatment, treating your own water with a filter or chlorine or some type of system to reduce those bacteria, viruses, and protozoa that cause disease. And so from my perspective in my group now, I'm an associate professor at Tufts, been here about 5 years. What we do is we do laboratory research on the efficacy of water, sanitation, hygiene interventions to prevent the spread of disease. We do field work to look at how effective these interventions might be when they're actually on the ground. Things are never as effective as they are efficacious in the lab when you do them perfectly. And then the last thing we do is policy work. So we work with World Health, with CDC, with Doctors Without Borders on getting these recommendations out into policy. So some of the things that we're really focusing in my group, just some examples, we work with a number of companies who are interested in designing and manufacturing household level water filters for household use. And they tend to design them in their laboratory. They work perfectly. We take them to users' homes and see what goes wrong and feed that back into the design process to be part of the user-centered design. We also do quite a bit of work with Ebola and cholera, the prevention of Ebola and cholera transmission within Ebola treatment units and cholera treatment centers. So how do you wash surfaces in an Ebola treatment unit? How do you clean hands? How do you prevent that transmission? And then also thinking about prevention of transmission in the household. So if we're thinking about if a cholera patient comes to a cholera treatment center, you want to prevent transmission to their families and neighbors. You might send someone to their house to spray it with chlorine to prevent transmission. You might give them a kit, a household disinfection kit, so they can clean their home like a spring cleaning to prevent transmission. Or they might receive chlorine tablets to treat their water, or they might receive trucked water. And a lot of these interventions to prevent the spread of cholera have literally been done approximately about 100 years. We've documented them being completed as early as the 1930s in China, but they've never really been evaluated. And we have real questions as to whether if you spray a surface in a household with chlorine, whether or not that will inactivate the cholera and reduce the transmission. So we're trying to go back and kind of complete the laboratory efficacy research and field effectiveness trials to fill in these evidence gaps so that we can make better policy. And I think right now we're focusing on cholera and Ebola, but there are a number of epidemic and potentially pandemic diseases that for which there are few or no medical countermeasures. And I think that's really where we're looking at focusing. How can water, sanitation, and hygiene prevent the spread of these diseases? And to pull that back to the US, we do a little bit of US work as well, not much. But we have seen some of this work that we've been doing in prevention of cholera, prevention of disease come up as we're getting questions with the current situation in Puerto Rico, where the infrastructure has been down for many people for about a month. And what we're seeing is some of the interventions we use in these emerging economies, distribution of aquatabs, chlorine tablets to prevent the spread of cholera, we're seeing those interventions be brought to Puerto Rico because the infrastructure has not been able has not been prioritized to be rebuilt as quickly as it needs to be to prevent disease transmission. And so I think as we grow, as these issues of sustainability, these issues of funding of infrastructure, some of this disease transmission work may actually sadly come back to the more what we have considered developed economies. And so that's a very brief summary of my work now at Tufts and how that built on what I learned from MIT. And I'm happy to take questions, but I think for now, I'll hand it back over to the next panelist. So thank you so much for being here, and thanks for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Danielle, for that great introduction to your work. Next, I'd like to hear from Kenneth.
So I am the grandfather on the panel, having had 3 degrees at MIT and starting in civil engineering and having the wonderful privilege of going to Mali in 1974 in the middle of the drought, working with an anthropologist at the village scale to try to come up with solutions, which we then call appropriate technologies to deal with these issues. And that started me on a career which led me to see that the issues grew from technology as a base, but then we had to deal with economics and then finally policy. And as we look at things globally, we have to look at all of them because we look at things globally in terms of scale. And so if we talk about water at the global scale, we do not have a water crisis globally. We consume about 10% of the total runoff on the globe. However, there are places in the United States and other places where we're using 100 or 1,000 times the recharge that is coming locally. So there are these hot spots which happen in terms of local, and there is a lot of effort to transfer water from water rich places to water poor places, but generally the environment and ecosystem is what is hurt when we do that. And there are a lot of wetlands that are being looked at throughout the globe as sources of water, but then these wetlands will then be impacted by that source of water. So we have a great policy and moral and ethical issue as we go forward in developing our water. And the work that Karen was talking about was really essential. And how do we develop sustainability in our water systems? And then in other areas, as we're working at MIT now in Saudi Arabia, how do you trade off between desalination, which brings issues to the Gulf, versus depleting the groundwater? And how do we do that and look at sustainability for future generations? One of the key things I see in our work as we move forward is the whole issue of urbanization. And just in China alone, a rural Chinese person will use about 50 liters per person per day. If they move to an urban setting, it becomes about 200 to 250 liters per person per day. So without increasing the population, we can have massive increases in the demands for water. And then these lead to, as Jean pointed out, the whole water quality issue is what do we do with, if we're downstream, what do we do with this water? It's not necessarily all about the quantities, but also the qualities of that water and how do we bring it together. And then it brings us to a word which has become another N word, the nexus of energy and water. And there's a huge debate in Africa about whether we use water for hydropower or water for irrigation or water for people or water for environment. And those are policy decisions that start being made at the government level. And how do we bring that in? And then the whole idea of equity. Do we do small scale irrigation or large scale irrigation or hydropower? What are the economics and how are the poor and those involved getting the benefits of the water? And lastly, we have two important issues as we face this is what is the threat of climate change in all of this? It's increasing the demand for agriculture for water, and in some places increasing water supply, but decreasing it. In a study we've just completed at MIT at the center I work with, we've showed in Asia to 2050, economic and population growth is 10 times more important than climate change in that region. However, if you go to Africa, it is climate change in the arid and semi-arid regions, which are threatening the infrastructure that we're building now and for future populations. And how much do we do to anticipate that and spend in adaptation? So it is an issue that addresses us all, and everybody on the call are dealing with really important issues. And one of the key things I like about this talk is that we need to work together and do what we call strategic cyclical scaling. Some have to look globally, some have to look local, but if we just stay in our spheres, we're not going to solve the problems. We have to be sharing this information so better policy can be made. And that's my career after getting a BS, an MS, and a PhD from MIT. I ended up getting a master's in economics while I was at University of Colorado, because that's where so many decisions are made. And then in my later part, I've seen policy is the key. So now I work at the Kennedy School at Harvard teaching the group there on water policy and the technology of water. So events like that bring these things together, I think, are the crucial way that we move forward and across scales, across disciplines, and not forgetting the Sloan School. And we have to finance all of this. So how do we bring public-private partnership together and multi-sector? And the last thing is we're all talking about quality and quantity in supplying water. But the key thing we're seeing is in urban settings and others is the threat of flooding. And particularly with so many people on the coast, we've just seen this recently in Texas and Florida, and so dramatically in Puerto Rico, is why we're seeing increased droughts under climate change. We're also seeing increased flooding, and that takes out our infrastructure that is so valuable. So as we look at this, we have to look at all the scales in making our infrastructure climate resilient to the best we can. So I'm excited to be with my my fellow alums here, and let's see what questions are out there for us.
Okay, thank you so much, Kenneth, and thank you to all of our panelists. Fortunately, we now have a lot of time to ask them questions, and a couple of great questions have already come up. So one person asked if the panel can comment on current EPA initiatives, especially if there are any that you find inspiring. Several of you have talked about the importance of policy in combination with technology, and so I wonder if anyone could comment on current EPA initiatives. Thanks, panelists.
If you may probably allow me to take this opportunity to comment on one of the EPA programs. So Citizen Sciences for Environmental Protection. It's a program where you can engage citizens, because I saw that there's Nat 30, the question was from Nat 30. So she mentioned that she has a student. So when you have students, you can engage them in a way that you can allow them to test like small, I would say soft water indicators like pH, turbidity, but where you use tools that makes students between themselves interact. But the type of citizen science, it helps you to use the methodologies we know, and it links you to understand the role of the environment in your general day-to-day life, the importance of water quality. So that would engage more the younger or future scientists we would have to really know the problems that we are facing at early age. So I think the citizen science that brings, technology versus community versus the problems in environment, either water or others, that's a good program under the EPA. So second, we have another EPA programs, because currently EPA is improving the water testing technologies from culture-based to molecular-based, which I think as the technology in biological sciences improves, so we are getting to the level where if we want to understand the sources of contaminations, we can know exactly from what source using microbial source tracking markers. Before, our beaches used to be contaminated and people would tell us E. coli is very high. But people would always ask in a community, why? Why is the beaches closed today? Where is the E. coli from? And we did not have those answers. So the new upcoming molecular tools will help address those questions. And so that's another program, I would say, where EPA works hard to improve the standards we have in the water according to the progress of science, which of course helps the community answer different questions we always face within, enjoying the environment and what we may face as questions and how do we address them using either new technologies and how EPA adapts to those. So I think those would be like my 2 points.
One of the programs that I find interesting right now is there's a program from the U.S. Department of Agriculture called forest to faucets. And this is aimed at looking to better understand the connection between, in the United States, between rural areas and urban water quality. So a lot of cities, for instance, New York City, they have a large watershed that is more rural, but is increasingly being developed for agriculture or other uses. And so the Forest to Faucets program is looking to better map, sort of related to what Jean-Pierre is talking about, is these distributed stresses on the system and their impacts on a specific water management issue. Another thing that I think, a question, the topics come up from Jean-Pierre, and one of the questions also related to education and how do you get children involved, and how do you get people involved in general. I think there's an increasing opportunity, and it hasn't yet really been tapped, to use, and this is also related to work Danielle's doing, which is these idea of like kits or distributed monitoring. So you have all this social media infrastructure, and how do you get people to use this in a way that can help us to better monitor and understand some of the stresses we're facing, whether it's flooding in different areas or things like the Flint water crisis. It would be great if, for instance, when somebody had an issue, if they could just report it, and then there's a system that collects it, and we can better, it's not perfect data, but it's data. And an example of this is in the recent flooding in Texas. For instance, some of the state government had put out a website that was allowing people to report on floods, and just individuals reporting the flooding in their location was updating faster than than we can do with hydrological modeling. And so I think that this is a big frontier going forward, is using crowdsourcing information in a way that can help us as researchers and water managers.
Okay, my computer is telling me my internet connection is unstable, but hopefully y'all can hear me. Thank you both for your responses. Another question that's kind of related is, generally, what as individuals can we each do to help with global water problems? You mentioned helping with monitoring and reporting, but what else should we be doing if we care about water and want to help as an individual?
I think this is Danielle. In the questions, I've been looking at them, and a lot of them have been about what I call decentralized organizations that individuals can take action with. And I generally put these decentralized organizations like Rotary International, church groups, Engineers Without Borders. And these decentralized organizations have an incredible amount of power because it's really building on personal one-on-one connections and the ability of people to help and to see. It's very different to donate money to a large like UNHCR than it is to go and help people directly. And I think there's benefits and drawbacks to both of them. I think there's a loss of efficiency in the kind of one-on-one connections, but there's a gain in the personal connections and power. I think one of the things I see with these with the decentralized organizations is a lack of technical knowledge, like sometimes not knowing which intervention is appropriate in which space. And I work with a lot of Rotary clubs to say they often know a community through one person, and they know a filter through another person. And so they assume they can put filter and community together and that will work out great. And often maybe that filter is not appropriate for that community. So I think when it's about individual help, I would encourage people to act through the organizations that they're familiar with, their churches, their Rotaries, their clubs, their Engineers Without Borders, but to work to gain, and this is MIT, and I can say this, to gain the technical knowledge to make sure that the interventions you're distributing are actually correct for the location. Because I think these personal decentralized projects are great, even though they're very inefficient from an efficiency perspective. They have other incredible gains, but I do see a lot of inappropriate things distributed because people aren't seeing the larger picture. So I'd say join up with other groups, learn something about the space, learn the technical side. And I think that probably answers 4 or 5 of the questions I've seen pop by about these individual actions. I don't know if other panelists have something to say.
I'd like to jump in on Danielle's comment and say, I cannot tell you what the benefit is for you to go and actually see these things somewhere and to be involved and understand rural water supply. But then at the other side is people that are watching are technologists. If you're alums, you may have something that can contribute directly through IT. There's been a lot of work with how you use cellular phones to help with crops and water supply and things like that. So I think there's a lot of creative and skills out there that contribute, particularly financing. How do we do things with impact financing? And most people are willing to pay for water. How do we make it available is the other issue. And the other thing is I can't say enough in the terms of policy, our Congress responds to lobbying and pressure. And we're seeing that happen in 2 ways. One is conditions put upon the aid, and then countries being left off because they're not, part of the political wind that we want. And also the other danger that happens is, and I'd like my colleagues to go, is disaster release is not development. And many times it's negative to development if it continues. And this somewhat relates totally to the refugee crisis. We build refugee camps that are designed for 6 months and they're there for 30 years and the infrastructure is poor. So getting involved, there's so much online, getting on a plane and going with part of an organization, and you may come back and never dig a well or do something like that by your hands, but by working with organizations, helping to raise money, doing those kind of things will be really valuable, or just sponsoring somebody to come in scholarships, getting the technology, getting the expertise in the countries back where it's needed. So I think, again, at all scales, but doing something, whatever it is important now.
I'd like to encourage, on a similar note, I'd like to encourage people to get more involved with their local water resources. Like, we're talking a lot about international development, but actually there's a huge growing water crisis just in the United States and in other developed countries where most of our urban water infrastructure was built in the early 20th century, and it's aging, and it's increasingly leading to unsafe water conditions or pipe breaks. An example of this being Flint, Michigan, where we have some outdated infrastructure. It's still being used because it's working more or less. At least you can pour your tap and water comes out. But a lot of this old infrastructure, we just don't know what the risks are. We haven't mapped them out, and we need money to do that. And so this is to Ken's point about, we need Congress to invest in new water infrastructure, but also just having awareness as a local community and raising, increasing public education can really help to offset some of these risks as we move forward. I just have a personal comment about international projects related to, for instance, Rotary International. So in 2009, it's a few years ago, I know, but I rode my bicycle from Cape Town to Dar es Salaam, and we had brought a water filter, but actually I never ended up using it. And so what we did is we would carry water on our bikes and then fill up at stations that people thought were safe. And these stations were primarily ground hole wells that were primarily built by Rotary International. And so just a point that, like, international, some of these international projects can really have a big impact on the local community and some important benefits.
Okay, thanks everyone for your answers. We have another question about the role of nuclear power in desalination, particularly in Singapore. And I think you could also more generally comment on the energy-water nexus and the needs of energy for creating clean water, the use of clean water in creating energy. I'm sure some of you have thought a lot about this, so hear what you have to say.
So I'll just start and that we at MIT have a strong linkage with the Middle East in terms of water supply, and in the mechanical engineering department, there's quite a bit of work going on in desal and all things related to that. And there was a very large project that is just winding down in Saudi Arabia on solar powered desal. And there's a lot of work going on that to use, particularly in the countries which have the sunshine, to use solar power for desal. I would think the issue of nuclear power for desal, all the other negative externalities with nuclear power, I don't think they're necessarily needed for desal itself. We could use traditional fossil and solar and some other issues, because that's a bigger issue in terms of the nuclear power, but we do need energy for it. But I think there are other sources that can be done, and that's not necessarily a reason for nuclear. There's other things with wind that we can use, and as we get batteries, or we can treat when we do have the energy with renewables and store the water. So using storage rather than going to nuclear is something that I would recommend in a developing setting, but that's part of the whole energy water issue. I don't know if others have some thought about that as well.
That's great. Thank you, Kenneth. So another question that came up is, what can we do to educate the next generation of engineers, policy makers, and technologists, particularly girls and communities that are historically underrepresented in these fields? What can we do to encourage them to be interested in and get the education they need to solve these pressing problems like water safety and supply in the world?
I think in general, what we're seeing in our undergraduate curriculums is that the students are coming in super interested in addressing climate change and health and water, and seeing these large scale societal problems. And actually at the undergraduate level, I'm seeing some massive changes in the degree programs to go from more traditional, like you take a class in CAD and you take a class in water hydraulics, and instead teaching concepts through project-based learning, through group-based learning, and some real changes at the undergraduate level. So I'm seeing some real positives at MIT, at Tufts, at other schools I'm working with within the undergraduate level, but thinking about getting people into, and particularly women and minorities, and providing exposure and encouraging people to go into STEM. I think the biggest thing we've seen is that particularly for women and minorities, providing hands-on activities that can show that you can improve these situations, that don't just say climate change is terrible and we're all going to die. That doesn't help anybody, especially those who are 5 to 18, right? But thinking about, this is a project I can do that I can have hands-on impact, and I can make a difference, and I can see that. And so they see the application of their potential STEM career. And so I'd highly recommend those type of hands-on science STEM activities that are related to these large societal problems that I think the 5 to 18-year-olds are really thinking about in the US right now. And there's a whole bunch of groups that are doing that, and depending on where you are, you can get connected to them. But that's where I'm seeing the kind of the K-12 curriculum going, as well as the undergraduate curriculum at universities in the US going.
Thank you, Danielle. Do any of the other panelists have a comment?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so I had a comment about this, really, because it's one of the issues that always surprises me. You know, we have communities that are the most affected in the United States, and most of the times we found ourselves that most of these affected communities, they don't have at least people who may have specialized in different subjects that can actually help guide their community, and because they already have that trust built in because they have been with the community for a long term. And also I see like a poor, I would say like a poor story sharing type of approach, where like most of the times in the United States, or even in other developing countries, we don't have like a platform where people share stories of these successful actions that are going on. Of course, we know that there are water issues and it's very challenging, but there are race, platform where people share good, positive stories where they show how they have addressed complicated problems of water accessibility. For example, what Daniele mentioned earlier, how people, for example, currently, what are people doing in Puerto Rico, applying soft technologies to help people reduce spread of some waterborne disease that may happen. Those are stories that should be told, and that inspires younger generation to understand that we can have this massive, really hurricane, but then what I know as application of technologies or like reducing water pollution, I can be helping people, not because I have probably advanced high level of education, but those soft skills and tools that can help people, which are hands-on, and how do we share this within our community and encourage people to see that as a path for their career. And also, like as I said too, like in at different platforms, either within the minority communities, to have that platform where we, all of this information shared are incorporated in a school programs or curriculum, where people have the chance to share about solutions. These were the problems. This is how engineers solve it, and that would, I think, that would be also one of the pathways to inspire younger generation on how, the problems we have, how have they been solved, and be inspired on being a part of such generation, and engineers focusing on practical solutions.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Very exciting, looking toward the future of water with all of these people with education, inspiration to work on these problems. If we can just wrap up, I would love to have each of you share very briefly kind of your vision for the future of water. It could be colored by your field or a global vision of what water will look like in a sustainable future. But what do you see for the future?
Yeah, so I can start. So which probably but yeah. So I would say that the future is very challenging, but yet also requires knowledge and know-how on how to solve the problems of water, not only because we are in the developed countries and we feel like developing countries are the ones who are more raw and like we should help them. But today, remember, we have issues in Flint. We have wells around Wisconsin and other areas in the United States which are contaminated, where people need solutions that are similar to those we see currently being applied in developing countries. So I think that the future, we will have this knowledge sharing between developing and developed countries, because developed countries can help large scale, scaling up like large water distribution systems, but the experience in developed countries can help either United States, when we have disasters and all of that, the technologies we use are those technologies that probably one cannot immediately think about in the United States when it comes to solving those problems. So we will have issues of infrastructure, we'll have still issues of different water pollution levels, where we need still science to help us know how to identify those different levels of contaminations and how to teach our community on how to solve them. So yeah, the future is very exciting, but also very challenging. So I would call to those who participated to keep encouraging young generation to pursue career either in water, energy, water science, because we are needed, and I think all different contributions are needed to be able to achieve our goal and have a healthy environment. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Would any of the other panelists like to share their vision for the future?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. And I'm Karen. Building on what Jean-Pierre said, this idea of, a lot of people maybe, like he's saying, think of developing world problems and developed world problems as being fundamentally different, but they actually share a lot of similarities. At the same time, as the developing world needs a lot more infrastructure, but they currently lack a lot of it. And so this provides an opportunity for technological leapfrogging, where they could actually, they could become more advanced than so-called developed world cities, just because they have so little to begin with, and we could start them off at a better place than we currently are. In terms of like what a future sustainable city might look like, I think we're still going to be using some of the main technologies that were common in the 20th century. Some of the centralized urban water infrastructure, we're still going to need reservoirs, we're still going to need pipes, but we're increasingly going to be integrating this with more distributed, decentralized solutions, such as one of the things that we can do for flooding, which also helps improve urban water quality, is increasing landscaping, bioswales within the city. Singapore's really looked at increasing vegetation within the city area so that they can collect water from the city and then treat it and use it as a fresh water, potable water resource. And so just this more integrated approach to water management is important. And that opens up new areas for people who maybe don't think of water science as a career, but they are really interested, for instance, in architecture or landscape design or community building. These distributed solutions need those types of careers as well.
Thanks, Karen. Danielle or Kenneth, do either of you have a brief last comment on vision?
I would just add and echo what Karen was saying. I think the conversation can easily be framed as, in the developed world, we have infrastructure and everything's fine. And in the developing world, it's, it's all needs to be developed and it's a mess. And I think that we need to be much more kind of holistic in our thinking, and that it's really kind of the World Health and the Joint Monitoring Program, we're talking about ladders of, ideally you would want 24/7 access to safe treated water delivered on plot. That's an ideal. But if you can't have that, what's next and what's next and what's next, and at the lowest level is you walk 30 minutes to collect water from a river. And I think that I'd like to see the thinking be less binary and more holistic, and understanding, let's try and move every person in the world up the ladder, particularly focusing on those with the least resources right now. And that's what I would, to kind of make this holistic, and I'm thinking about it in terms of health, but we can also think of terms of that as Karen and Ken and others are talking about in terms of water management and the environment. And so that's how I summarize, and thank everybody else for their comments.
So I'll tie this together to just let everybody know who's an alum. I was just on the panel that MIT has a sustainable stormwater team that has just started to do that very aspect on campus. How do we change the campus and redesign the landscape to be sustainable to deal with flooding and those issues? I think the last thing is that at 3 levels. One is we have to think very creatively. We haven't changed much, as both many have said, since the late 19th century when public health came around. And this idea of public health engineering that Tufts is leading, I think, is key, because we spend a lot of water to take our wastes and then pollute the water with them. Can we come up with some dry type of waste removal that would save the need for water? Somebody out there, there's 52 of you left, maybe you can solve that. The other thing is integrated approaches, as we've heard. And finally, I think there's this level we forget now of two moral issues. One is many in environments thinks that commercial and private sector is evil. And the other thing is they do behave evil at times, but how do we use the economic systems we're in to help solve problems where there are real profits can be made, not greed, and people are taken care of? But then finally, we have to share. I mean, we are in the developed world, very rich, and some of these issues we need to just reach out, and it's going to be costly. So I think we have to be generous with our time, with our income, and sometimes with our security in dealing with these issues. And I think, we have been given much to have a degree from MIT, and it's now we need to give back however that is. And it doesn't mean volunteering. It could be through your commercial activities and supporting people in your neighborhood to work on this. So I'm excited that this kind of panel is going on and excited about the generations that are coming to solve these things. And just to let everybody know, when I was a undergraduate, we had one woman and 9 men in civil engineering. And 2 years ago, I taught the hydrology class and we had 13 women and 3 men. So there is a change coming on, and we're changing the curriculum to deal with real issues, and we're making it more open and less onerous to work together. So I'm excited to have met all of you on the panel, and then the others that have been on board.
All right, thank you, Kenneth. Thank you all panelists, and thank you alums for all of your great questions. I'm going to turn it over now to the closing remarks by Aaron. No, okay, I'll do the closing remarks. All right, on behalf of the Alumni Association, thank you for tuning into this faculty forum online. Thanks again to our alumni panelists from MIT, Michigan State, Tufts, and University of Colorado. Even though we didn't get to all the questions, we will forward all the questions to the panel and try to get answers to you. And please tweet about today's chat using the hashtag MITBetterWorld and send follow-up questions or feedback to alumnilearn@mit.edu. Thank you again for watching.